Over 7 months ago, I bought 4 of these Haworthia at Walmart and they were just overflowing with babies. I took apart one of them and removed all of the babies, but they didn't have any roots attached to them. So I decided to wait on the other 3 plants and let them grow a little bit larger before separating out the babies. Here you can see those 3 that have not been separated yet. And then in these smaller containers are the plants, the little babies that I pulled off the big mother plant. Since then, the big mother plant has been given away. However, I do still have all of these babies, and as you can see, some of them have done a lot better than the others. This has really just come down to the frequency in watering and how well these individual babies ended up rooting. If I pull them up in the succulent tracker app here, you can see these large ones have not been watered for about 45 days, and even though it's been a super long time, they are still extremely firm and don't have any indications that they actually need water right now. You can also see that on average they've been watered every 17 days, which is pretty frequent. Haworthia do tend to tolerate a little bit more frequent watering than most succulents, and these are also under very intense grow lights, so they can tolerate being watered that frequently. On the other hand, these little babies, this is what they looked like when I first planted them. Again, this was a little over 7 months ago. They have been watered on average every 8 days, but there have definitely been periods of time where they've gone 2 to 3 weeks without water. That happened a lot actually in the beginning. I had intended to water them almost every day or every couple days, but I didn't quite get into that habit, and so they went a long period of time without getting consistent water. That's the main reason I attribute to some of them not growing very well or growing very much in 7 months time. A couple of them like this have started to grow, but this has actually only even been in the last few weeks. Once they rooted, they really started taking off. Some of these I think still haven't rooted, or maybe just have a couple of roots like this, and they really just haven't grown very much. So you can see this one really only has 2 little roots on it. It's really not doing very well. They're under bright grow lights for 13 hours a day, and that's just a lot for Haworthia, which are typically partial sun or shade plants. The combination of that with these being very tiny and not having roots kind of set them up for a stressful growing period. I planted these in magic succulent soil, which retains water a little bit longer than the typical gritty mix that I normally use. However, I still just wasn't watering them frequently enough to help them really get rooted and start to grow. I do need to be more consistent with my watering in order to help them grow faster and get bigger like those other ones that I just showed you. There's 7 of these smaller pots with babies in them, and I would say 4 of them have plants that are starting to root and starting to look more like a Haworthia, but these other 3 just have very underwatered, very stressed out little babies in them. My goal is to start watering these more frequently to help them grow a little bit faster, and I may even add some worm castings on top of the soil just to help them get a little bit more nutrients, stay wet a little bit longer, and grow a bit faster. For most succulents, I wouldn't recommend trying to speed up their growth. However, because these are under grow lights for so long and they don't actually need as much light as they're getting, they can tolerate that faster rate of growth and won't stretch out like an Echeveria or a Kalanchoe or some other faster growing succulents might. I mentioned earlier that these had gone 45 days since their last watering, and if I try and kind of do the taco test on them, you can see these leaves are still incredibly firm. I've been letting them dry out because today I want to separate out the babies and plant them up on their own, and then plant the main mother succulent up on its own as well. I'm curious to see if these have more roots than the plant that I originally worked with and divided into all of these other little pots. I'm anticipating that some of the babies will have a few roots of their own, but I wouldn't be surprised if most of them do not. There are still quite a few small babies in here that may still have a little bit of a hard time on their own, but if I can get my watering routine consistent, they should be able to root fairly quickly and then start growing much larger. Let's go ahead and pull this out and see what the roots and these babies are looking like. I can tell just from trying to tug on this pot that the roots have really filled up inside the pot and are probably attached to the inside wall a little bit too. There we go. We do have a nice healthy root system in here. I don't see any signs of rot, and I also don't see any deflated roots either. Sometimes if you're watering a plant really consistently, like I was with this one every 14 or so days, and then you go a long period of time, like 45 days without watering, sometimes the roots can start to deflate, which makes it harder for it to rehydrate once you do water again. However, with this one, everything is looking really healthy and nice. These succulents were just planted, like I said, about 7 months ago, so I am going to go ahead and reuse the soil. If I feel like they need a little bit of nutrients, I'll just add some worm castings, but I would say the soil is still pretty fresh. Now, if we look in close here, I'm going to try and pull out just any dead or shriveled up leaves. So now the question is, which succulent do I try and pull off first? Which little baby seems like it is going to be the easiest to remove and most likely to come with roots? So you can see this baby right here does have one root coming off of it. This is what I hoped for with the other plant that I pulled apart in the previous repotting of all of these. I wanted to have babies that had at least 1 or 2 roots on them, just because it makes it a little bit faster for them to start growing after they've been removed from the mother plant. These are just so tight on there. I think I'm going to end up just, breaking. This is what most of the babies looked like last time, just a fresh cut here and no roots. They will, like I said, continue to grow, but I am going to see if I can get some of these with some roots just to help them have a better start. That cracking sound just sounds terrible, but it's totally fine. And look at that, we've got a baby with a nice long root attached to it. This is exactly what I wanted. I'm just gonna work my way around here. I'm gonna go ahead and pull off that one that I showed you up close that had a root. Oh, and look, it's got another one attached. This is a much better start than when I did this 7 months ago. The other thing that's nice about having waited for these plants to pull them apart is the babies are a lot bigger. So having roots and also being larger make it easier for the babies to survive when you're separating them from the mother plant. All right, here we go. One itty bitty root there. Oh, wait, nope, it's got a couple. That one has a lot of roots for its size. Now, as I mentioned, the snapping is totally fine. These can break off and they will still be just fine. However, you do want to let that wet end callus over before you pot them in soil. I love that one random little root sticking out there. All right, looks like I've got 2 more to go. Aha, that one's got a good root on it as well. And, oh, look at that. Okay. This one's got some roots. And then there is another baby starting in here because it didn't have enough to begin with. I love Haworthia and how prolific they are. Oh, that's actually 2 babies. We've got one there and one there. Exciting. So there's the mother plant that's going to go in a pot on its own. And then I'll go ahead and put these little cuttings into some smaller pots as well. Let's do plant number 2. Even though it's been 45 days since I last watered, this soil is actually pretty moist still. I don't remember for sure what type of soil I used, but it looks like it was probably just some leftovers from other random repottings that I did. Haworthia are some of the few succulents that can tolerate staying wet that long, but this can frequently happen if you have a container that is plastic. It won't dry out as quickly as something like terracotta. But it's also good to just keep track of your watering frequency, and that way you have an idea of when your succulents might need water again. I really have started relying a lot more on the taco test and only watering when my succulents are starting to feel deflated. These are definitely not deflated. They're still very firm. And so this could go quite a bit longer without water, which makes sense because the soil was damp. And so it basically had consistent access to water, even though it had been 45 days since I last watered them. With this one, I am noticing a few unhealthy roots. These look like they maybe could have rotted. They're kind of flat and deflated. Given that the soil was still wet, my guess is that these are on the brink of rotting, but there are still a lot of healthy roots still attached to this plant. The previous plant had the mother plant plus 8 babies that I removed from it. This one looks like it is going to have a similar number. So let's go ahead and just start pulling them off. Even though I know it's fine, that little crack just still, it's kind of a scary sound. There's a bunch of very small babies here. I think I'm gonna leave those attached and just pull off the bigger ones. I do like that most of these are coming off with the roots. Okay, I'm really torn on this. These babies are not huge. I like them to be at least about an inch in size. I would say these are probably ½ an inch right now. That one is fairly large, so let me pull that one. Oh, and it just popped right off. But I think I'm gonna leave the rest of these on it still. I was actually thinking to have this plant be one that I sell at an upcoming market, but I think I'm gonna just leave it and let it help these little babies grow, because they will grow a lot faster still attached to the mother plant. And here is the last one. It has a variety of sizes attached to it as well. So as I pull them off, I'm curious to see if I'll leave most of them or pull most of them off. So this soil is also a little bit damp, but not nearly as wet as that previous container was, which just kind of goes to show, even though it's the same type of plant in the same type of pot, in roughly the same type of soil, you're going to have some variation in how the plants respond and in how quickly the soil dries out. It's always hard to know where to begin. You just have to kind of like pick one and then move around from there. This one seems like, oh man, these are so tight together. Ah! Ooh, that was not a good removal. That one really broke. Look at what is in there. It's a little baby. These are just the plants that keep on giving. There we go. That was a little better. It's always interesting to see what size of plant the roots are attached to, because this one is pretty small and it has a nice long root attached to it. But then this one from the previous plant is quite large and just has a little root attached to it. It's definitely a lot easier to get the other babies off once you have a couple of them removed. Look at that. So much root for just a little baby. Okay, this one is a little bit bigger, though most of them on this plant are still pretty small. Check out this cluster that's left. There's the mother plant, which is actually not very big. I'd say it's maybe 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches. These little babies are just so close together and very, very tight. Whew. Whoa, check this out. These plants are like the Energizer Bunny. They just keep going and going and going. Now that I've pulled off those other babies, these are gonna start growing much faster. So I'm curious to see over the next few months how big these grow as I continue to water them. And then this little cluster of 3 is now much easier to get apart. Almost just kind of falls apart. There are a lot more dead roots inside this one, and I'm curious if that's because of how I've been caring for them, or if they were roots that were just kind of bad in the first place before I potted them up. Kind of hard to say, but either way, there's enough healthy roots on there that I'm not too concerned about it. 7 months ago, when I broke apart the first of these 4 pots of succulents, I don't think any of the babies came off with roots. I think all of them were just a clean break. Whereas if you contrast that with this, I think I only have 2 here that don't have any roots. There's a few that just have very small roots, but even that is better than nothing. So 2 of 20-ish versus all of the 10 or so that I planted from the previous one. So if you're debating whether or not to pull apart your Haworthia or an aloe or other plants like that that have a lot of pups or chicks, I definitely recommend waiting until they're a little bit larger so that you can repot them with some roots. I'm gonna let these sit overnight just so the ends can callus over, the roots have a chance to heal a little bit, and then I'll go ahead and pot all of them up, probably individually, but I might group a couple of them together in the same pot. This one just still makes me so happy. Look at all those little babies growing. Now that these have had a day to dry, you can see they're not very glossy right here. These are scabbed over, so they are now ready to be repotted. Here's also just a close-up look at the one that didn't have roots, and you can see the end has really calloused over. It's not glossy, it's not wet, so this will make it less likely to rot as I repot it. I'm gonna start by repotting the big ones just back into a large pot. I'm going to put these in a fresh batch of the gritty mix that I typically use for planting succulents. The soil didn't dry out super quickly in some of the other pots, and while the succulents seemed to be okay for the most part, I do want these to dry out much more quickly, especially because they do have such healthy roots right now. I just don't want to put that in jeopardy. So I am going back to the actual gritty mix that I use. So there's the first one potted up. It still takes up most of this pot, and these little babies I think are really going to start to grow a lot more quickly over the next few months. Of the 3 mother plants, this is the smallest one, but it does have all of those little babies on the side. So I'm really curious to see how this one grows over the next few weeks and months, and how quickly those babies start to be much more noticeable and growing around the base and kind of spreading out. It's a little hard to see from this angle, but I did plant this so that the babies are actually exposed. I got all of the roots covered, but I didn't want to cover up the babies just to give them a little bit more space to hopefully spread out and start growing. This last one does have a few little babies on it, and I just noticed some really new starts right here. I think it's going to do really well in this gritty mix, and I'm going to make sure that these pots are lifted up off the ground a little bit, just to make sure that the water is draining out completely and not getting trapped in the bottom of the pot. This is actually something we talked about recently in our Succulent Lovers Club. When you have a pot like this where the bottom is just flat and there's nothing to keep it from sitting flush on the countertop, you're more likely to get water trapped in the bottom of the pot, because even though it has that drainage hole, it's a lot harder for the water to actually flow out. So I've been putting my succulents on a kind of grid sort of mat that keeps them about 1/2 inch off the surface that they're sitting on. So that way there's a little bit of airflow on the bottom. I did something similar with my pots outdoors when I had them on my patio. I would put them up on something called pot feet, and I'll link to those in the description. But anything you can do to get your pots up off the ground so that there's actually a gap between the base and the surface they're sitting on will help them dry out a lot more quickly. With all these little babies that I pulled off, I'm going to group them together in some larger pots. I would like them to grow larger more quickly, so I am going to use this recycled soil that they were originally planted in, because it does have a little bit more organic material, so it'll retain water a little bit longer. While my goal is to get them big enough where they can actually be sold or given away on their own in a 3-inch pot, I'm going to put them together just to make it easier to take care of them while they are so small. I usually mention this with leaf propagation, but it applies to cuttings as well, or pups and offsets. You want to make sure that the roots are covered to help them stay healthier and retain water longer. If your roots are exposed, they're more likely to dry out. And that's actually one of the reasons why with leaf propagation, the babies tend to die quickly if they're not getting enough water, is because the roots are uncovered and dry out more quickly than if they were inside soil. Understandably, when pups are growing on the mother plant, they can get kind of misshapen or elongated, they can get curved stems, and overall the shape just looks a little bit funky. That is one of the reasons why I wanted to remove them at this size and plant them up on their own, is so they have space to actually grow out in that nice rosette shape and grow upward instead of out into the side. Here's another one that just has kind of some funky growth to it, a very unusual shape. For the most part, I've been putting these into groups of 3, but these little rosettes that I have left are pretty small, so I'm gonna go ahead and group them together. There's 6 of them. And then I have 3 more that did not have roots or very little roots, and I'll put those together as well. Two of these last 3 don't have any roots, and then the one just has a very tiny root. So I'm gonna go ahead and fill this pot with gritty mix, and then on the top, I'm gonna put coconut coir so that it stays wet a little bit longer and will encourage these to form new roots more easily. Now that those are all potted up, let's take a look at the whole group. What started out as 3 pots with a whole bunch of babies on it, now, as you can see, has turned into 10 pots. I'm gonna keep watering these a little bit more frequently over the next few weeks, and hopefully these babies will start to grow a lot more quickly now that they're not attached to the mother plant and have a lot more space to grow. As always, since I just repotted these, I'm gonna wait a day before watering them. At the beginning, I mentioned how these are still really firm and don't actually need water. However, since I have just repotted them, a lot of times that can kind of dehydrate the roots. So after I've waited a day, I am going to go ahead and water all of these again, but I will wait until these are looking a little bit more limp to water again after that. If you want to get a lot of plants for a great price, definitely keep your eye out for pots of succulents that have a lot of babies on them. You may have to be patient and wait a few weeks or months for those babies to get bigger before you can repot them on their own. But each of these costs me, I believe, about $4, and I have probably gotten at least $50 worth of plants, if not more, out of them. If you have succulents that you would like help with, or you want to learn more about propagating succulents, whether it's from pups and chicks like this, or from leaves, or from cuttings, I'd love to invite you to join our Succulent Lovers Club. Every month we have 2 live Q&A calls where you can come on and ask any questions. And then we also have a guest expert that comes in once a month. Every month it's a different topic, but we learn something new related to succulents. And then we also have a community area where you can post pictures throughout the week and share what's going on in your garden, get help with questions that you have, get help with identification, or just learn from other succulent lovers around the world. If you'd like to join, just head over to succulentsandsunshine.com/club to get all of the details. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.